Oh, hey Maddie, what's happening?
Not much, just chillin'. Hashtag reminiscing.
Hashtag Kentucky 8th grade mission trip.
Hashtag throwback.
Hashtag OMG.
Hashtag awesome.
Hashtag sloppy wet kiss.
In heaven meets
Eats
earth
earth like a sloppy wet
kiss.
inside my chin.
Hey guys, do you remember when Dan locked his keys in the car? Hashtag typical.
Hashtag he was
locksmith.
so angry. Hashtag angry veins.
Hashtag whitewater rafting.
Hashtag Mel almost drowned.
Hashtag Nathaniel ate a bug.
Hashtag worlds of fun.
Hashtag no air conditioning.
Hashtag brushing your teeth at Village Inn.
Hashtag yes.
Hashtag it was Denny's.
Hashtag awkward. But guys, Puerto Rico. Hashtag Nebby swag.
Hashtag Cali swag.
Hashtag Bandersnitches. Hashtag Cayman Lagoon Jackson.
Hashtag Everett. Hashtag 2 bathrooms.
Hashtag 1 bathroom.
Hashtag girls still don't poop.
Hashtag girls clog the toilet. Hashtag we don't talk about that.
The real fun was last year. Hashtag Miami.
Miami.
Hashtag no sleep.
Hashtag Providence Road Church. Hashtag Upside Down Beats.
Hashtag Cubans. Hashtag guys stealing my moose.
Hashtag confessions.
Hashtag Jake and Noah. Hashtag throwing pots.
Hashtag cry nights.
Hashtag Matchmaker.
Hashtag all those couples.
Hashtag Hashtag all broken up.
Hashtag
Miami driving.
Hashtag shake the van. Hashtag glad I didn't die.
Hashtag T Swift. Hashtag thanks Gavin.
But the best trip of all. Hashtag Nicaragua.
Hashtag oh yeah.
Hashtag poop pills.
Hashtag girls poop. Hashtag trucks.
Hashtag mud.
Hashtag frog dogs.
Hashtag rain boots.
I'm all about the fall retreats though. Come on. Hashtag fugitive. Hashtag senior girls 1.
Hashtag service project.
Hashtag sitting on sponges.
Hashtag first trip ever.
Hashtag pie in the face.
Hashtag twice.
Hashtag Live the Dark Sick Man.
Hashtag Gabe.
Hashtag Josiah's cop guard.
Hashtag almost died.
Hashtag those sticklers all over.
Hashtag Mickey Pancake.
Hashtag Dan's 4-wheel driving.
Hashtag cop car. Hashtag piling in. Hashtag people. Hashtag farting. Hashtag on me.
What?
Hashtag
Hashtag Gavin's breakfast.
Hashtag up all night.
Hashtag unite.
Hashtag the bus ride. Hashtag horse rides. Hashtag people falling off.
Hashtag it gave me a fear of horses.
Hashtag fugitive. Hashtag still the winners.
Hashtag
we didn't
legend.
cheat.
Hashtag new girl. Hashtag don't get it.
Hashtag save.
Hashtag welcome.
Hashtag Jesus changes everything.
Hashtag yes.
Hashtag go home.
Hashtag excuse me.
Hashtag out.